Welcome back to Viewpoint. I'm Jim Zogby. My next guest is Michael Isikoff, National Investigative Correspondent for NBC News and former Investigative Correspondent for Newsweek magazine. He's written extensively on presidential politics, national security and intelligence, and other national issues. Co-author of the book Hubris, the inside story of spin, scandal, and the selling of the Iraq War. Thanks for joining us.
Good to be here.
The book remains a must-read even long after it was written. And now that the president has announced the war has ended, it almost sounded to me like a mission accomplished speech. America is great again. Yeah. The war is over. And I actually wanted to ask you about that because you write about how the war started with hubris and lies. Well, and I'm wondering if it doesn't end with a little bit of the same.
Well, interesting. Well, first of all, it was 10 years ago this month that the Congress voted to authorize the president to use military force to overthrow Saddam Hussein, largely on the basis of what was publicly claimed at the time, that there was Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, it had a nuclear program, it had ties with Al-Qaeda, none of which turned out to be true. So I think that moment and the origins of the war are going to stand, as a major legacy of the era. It ranks as, certainly one of the great propaganda campaigns by a White House in modern times, and
beat out the Bay of Tonkin.
Gulf of Tonkin.
Gulf of Tonkin.
Well, it's a good one. I mean, I think that they'll both rank up there. The Gulf of Tonkin incident was a sort of briefer moment. The selling of the Iraq War was a concentrated campaign done in a very elaborate, considered way, and history will not look kindly in the way the war was sold to the American people. Now, that said, here we are 10 years later, 4,400 Americans killed, upwards of 100,000 Iraqis have been estimated to have lost their lives, billions and billions of dollars spent, and the jury is still out on what the final outcome is going to be. We are withdrawing all American military troops, but we're still going to have a substantial American presence in Iraq, including some 4,000 to 5,000 security contractors who, for all intents and purposes, are, they're armed and they're going to continue to be in harm's way. Certainly violence in Iraq, in fact, has spiked this year compared to last year. And where the Iraqi government is going to be, a year from now, 5 years from now, is still, we don't know. I think that everybody can be grateful that Saddam Hussein is no longer in power in Iraq. I don't think he has any sympathizers left in either Iraq, few in Iraq and certainly none around the world. But what Iraq is going to look like, what the Iraqi government is going to look like, and more importantly from the United States perspective, what kind of government is going to be? It's going to be, what are its ties going to be to Iran? These are still very big and important questions.
This issue of security contractors is an intriguing one because there's a privatization of military activity that we haven't paid a lot of attention to. The uniformed military are out, but these guys are former U.S. military, now working in private companies that we are subcontracting for, actually at higher salaries than the military make. And I saw a number of 1,800 of them killed in Iraq.
I'm not sure about that number. You may be right, but I mean, certainly a large number, and there's going to be a substantial, continued presence. And when you actually look at some of the numbers of how that sorts itself out, this gives you some idea. There was a report by the Special Inspector General for Iraq Reconstruction, Stuart Bowen, just this week, who was looking at one program run by the State Department, which is for the training of Iraqi police we've been trying to build up the Iraqi police force for, the entire time we've been there for the last decade, but we still have this ongoing program of upwards of $1 billion to train Iraqi police chiefs and leaders, not the rank and file, but they're the officers. And we're going to import something like 100 police captains, lieutenants from the United States to sort of help the Iraqis, and something like 3 or 4 times that number are going to be required in security contractors to protect them. So, multiples of the actual U.S. Presence of just these security contractors. And there was an interesting, Bowen's people interviewed the Iraqi Interior Minister, the Deputy Iraqi Interior Ministry about this program, and he told the Special Inspector General that this is money that could be better spent by the United States inside the United States, that the Iraqis didn't even need or want this programs, which does raise questions about the substantial U.S. presence that we're going to continue to have in Iraq.
I want to shift to Pakistan. You've written a lot about that in the last several months, and a number of the pieces actually have been disturbing. I've wanted to talk with you about them, and they all go to the same point, and that is the question that we've asked for years now about the degree to which ISI, the Pakistani intelligence services, are involved in training, recruiting, commanding elements who've committed atrocities. There was the trial in Chicago just recently of the American who was
Rana, who was convicted, but based on the testimony of this guy Headley, a Pakistani American who had been recruited by the ISI and then became essentially a terrorist, and gave testimony in court on behalf of the U.S. government that he had done the scouting for the Mumbai attack and selected the targets at the behest of the ISI. So here you had direct testimony from a United States government witness that was used to convict an American citizen, laying out that the ISI was directly complicit in the Mumbai attack, probably the worst terrorist attack since 9/11, and one that killed, I think it was 6 Americans. So I was surprised, frankly, that testimony didn't create, coming just a week or two after the bin Laden raid and all the public furor about how a bin Laden could have lived all these years in Abbottabad, within walking distance of Pakistan's West Point, their major military academy, and not have anybody in the Pakistani military know about it. I was surprised that the Rana trial and the testimony from Headley didn't create more of didn't get more attention, didn't create more of a fuss, because it was, as I said, direct testimony that the ISI was involved in a major terrorist attack that killed Americans. Now, since then, we've had the additional accounts of the Haqqani, of ISI aid to the Haqqani network, all of which has clearly raises disturbing questions about our relationship with Pakistan.
If you want to get in the conversation and give us a call, if you're calling from overseas, the number is 001-202-420-5665. If you're calling from here in the U.S., the number is 1-202-420-5730. The numbers will stay on the screen. Give us a call if you want to get in the discussion. After the bin Laden killing, there were calls here for an investigation of what they knew and when they knew it. Did anything come of that?
Not that we've seen publicly. I don't, this is the kind of thing where I don't think, even in spite of all this, And by the way, on the bin Laden thing, I've talked to people in the U.S. government who say, they don't have direct evidence. I mean, there's still deep suspicions. John Brennan expressed them from the White House that somebody must have known. They don't have the kind of direct evidence that they do have on ISI support for the Haqqani network, for instance, or as we saw with the Mumbai attack. But there's also a sense of, this is a very real issue for U.S. troops in Afghanistan because of the safe haven that the Taliban have with support from the Haqqani network and the Haqqani network attacks on U.S. commanders. But it's not as real for the American people. It's not a front burner issue as the economic news has gotten worse. Our attention has shifted back to the domestic sphere. Even though the war continues to go on, we still have, the surge troops present in Afghanistan. The future of our military presence there, and whether we're really making any substantial headway, are very large questions. And one thing that is just worth pointing out, and certainly not something that the White House will want Americans to hear over the next year, but when Obama took office, I think there was about 680 Americans who had been killed. More than 1,000 now have been killed under Obama's watch. Almost twice as much have been killed during Obama's administration as were killed in the I'm talking about Americans killed, as were killed in the entire, Bush administration, 2 terms. And, I think that the jury is still out on whether we've really made progress in Afghanistan and whether we're any closer to achieving anything that can be described as victory there.
It's interesting. We just did a poll in America about Afghanistan.
Yeah.
And what shocked me was that in almost every answer, about half the American people, and in some cases a little more than half, either have no opinion or don't seem to care.
Well, it's just
it's
not
almost an invisible war.
It is an invisible war. It's not on the radar screen. It's not on the front pages every day. It's certainly not on the evening news every night. And we're shouting about other issues, domestic issues that are very real to people. Yet, Americans are still dying. Americans are still being wounded and, horribly injured there. I
want to shift from Pakistan to PACs and look at some of the PAC stuff that's been going on. And I want to start actually with the story you did on Romney and the Romney Super PAC and the $1 million contribution.
Mystery contribution. The mystery contribution.
That if there's anything that says to me that the reform period of campaign finance was not really reform and now is over completely.
Yeah.
It's that story which sort of opens all kinds of possibilities up. Tell us a little bit about that story, because I thought it was shocking.
Well, it's interesting. We have come, so far. To those who believe that we needed campaign reform in this country, that money has too much influence in American politics, that we need greater transparency in government, all of which was sort of the fundamental premise of the McCain-Feingold law, which also passed 10 years ago. We have retreated so far from that we're back in what a lot of people say is the sort of pre-Watergate era of big money pouring in at unprecedented levels with no limits, because you have, thanks to the Supreme Court ruling, Citizens United, and some FEC decisions, it was a combination of the two.
Supreme Court ruling on Citizens United. Citizens United was the independent expenditure campaign.
Right, independent expenditures, and said that that corporations and outside groups can spend unlimited amounts in to.
It was a free speech issue.
Yeah.
Okay.
You couldn't infringe on their free speech as long as they didn't directly give it to the candidate and say vote for or vote against. They could express their opinion about election issues and do it, during the election era, and that's opened the door to these super PACs and their even more sort of sinister cousins, the so-called nonprofits that are real political advocacy groups that don't have to disclose their donors at all. So the super PACs can collect as much money, and they're collecting money in $1 million donations, whereas if you give to a political candidate, you're limited to $2,500. You can give $1 million to a super PAC that's backing that candidate. And if you don't even want your name associated with that, you can give to a nonprofit associated with that super PAC. In the story you're talking about, each of the candidates now have, including Obama, now have super PACs. This was a Romney Super PAC created by former Romney aides. They're supposed to be independent, and of course, when your former political operatives set it up for you, there's not much, there's not much independence there. But this was a Romney Super PAC which collected $1 million from a corporation that nobody had ever heard of before. W-Span LLC it was called. And what I did was sort of try to trace back that corporation and discovered that it had been created just a few weeks before the $1 million donation had been made, and then it dissolved just a few weeks after the $1 million donation. So it was clear that you had this sort of dummy corporation that was created for the sole purpose of pumping $1 million into this super PAC to help elect Mitt Romney, leaving no fingerprints whatsoever. Because of my story, there was a public clamor about it. There were complaints made to the FEC, and the donor basically was forced to out himself, because I think even the Romney people realized that this could lead to a Justice Department investigation, certainly an FEC investigation, and that was only going to create more of a controversy and mess. And it turned out to be a former Bain Capital Wall Street executive associate of Romney who was trying to help Romney. It was so his name is now known, but had it not been for this, this probably would have proliferated, and you've had people of all kinds of stripes with all sorts of motives doing the same thing. By the way, I don't think we can take too much, breathe too big of a sigh of relief about this, because there are still these political nonprofits that are sisters of the super PACs, and you can give anonymously to
the president's
those.
got one, Perry's got a bunch, Romney's got a bunch.
Yeah.
Karl Rove has set up the
Karl
granddaddy
Rove
of them all.
Karl Rove led the way in the 2010 election 2 years ago, after the Citizens United ruling.
And the issue here is that how much money do we think is going to get raised by these guys?
Oh God, Rove himself has said he's aiming for $240 million. The people who set it up for Obama say they're talking about $100 million. But it could be even more than that. And by the way, when Rove did it 2 years ago, Obama made an issue of this and said, this is these people are trying to hijack our democracy, and the American people deserve to know who's giving money to these elections to influence their elections, and we can't let the special interests take over. And of course, the Republicans won the 2010 elections. They got back control of the House, and what did we see this year? 2 former Obama aides, including his former press spokesman, Bill Burton, setting up their own operation modeled on the Karl Rove scheme, doing exactly the same thing that last year the president was denouncing.
And not likely that we'll see reform.
I don't think there's any prospect for reform at all at the moment. First of all, you have the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court was a big obstacle, and certainly the support is not there in Congress for reform at this point, unless there's a true scandal that outrages the American public, and that's what forced disclosure and limits. After Watergate, it was the Watergate scandal, and a part of which was big money that poured into the President Nixon's reelection campaign with no public disclosure, under the table, in huge denominations, some of which ended up paying for the Watergate
in cash too.
burglary.
It was a little bit more
in cash. But with these with the political nonprofits, we have no idea where the money is coming from, how it's being delivered, and from whom.
Yeah. Sort of makes we talked about the Tunisian election right before, makes it sound pretty clean.
Right. Look, bans on corporations giving to political campaigns go back to Teddy Roosevelt's era, 1908. And here we have, for all intents and purposes, corporations giving for political campaigns once again.
And the idea that Obama raised in the last election about foreign money, it actually could happen through these nonprofits. That
of course.
Let's just one last issue. We've always talked about civil liberties, and there are so many of those I want to get to, but we'll do that another time when I hope you'll come back and do it. But it's the Adel Jaber situation. He's somebody I know here in town.
Sure.
Many of us do. It was a rather shocking story. But as shocking as the story was, there also were a lot of questions about it. And you've been raising some of them.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, there's still a lot we don't know about what was really going on there, what the agenda. I mean, the people at the White House and in the U.S. government seem to be very convincing when they said in the days after that the criminal complaint that they were totally convinced that this was based on intelligence that went beyond the complaint, that the allegations were true, and that elements in the Quds Force, in the Revolutionary Guard, were aware of this and helped coordinate this operation. Now, of course, we haven't seen the intelligence. There's a lot we, yet don't know. But on the one hand, it seems incredibly bizarre that the guy who was selected to do this sort of itinerant, down on his luck, used car salesman in Texas,
with a drug problem,
would go to one guy to actually try to carry this off, and he just happens to be a DEA undercover informant. If you look closely at the complaint, it's a little unclear what he precisely had in mind when he first talked to the informant, and what ended up, what the charges ended up about the plot being. And so whenever you have the informant who's sort of working with the suspect, there's always the question, how much is he egging him on? How far would this have gone had there not been a U.S. government informant involved?
That's all the time we've got right now, but thank you so much, Michael, and welcome back to the show.
I'd be happy to do it.
Thanks for joining us tonight. Follow us on Twitter at AAIUSA, or log on to the website, aaiusa.org. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week on Viewpoint.